So I wanted to talk a little bit more about scientism, and I wanted to use a specific example to show why I think scientism is flawed. And then I'll explain a few other things that I think might clarify my position to those that were at edge, and explain what I mean by scientism. Now, I was actually looking at Wikipedia, and further down the page, there's what I think was a better definition of scientism. Scientism, here's a definition I like: a totalizing view of science, as if it were capable of describing all reality and knowledge, or as if it were the only true way to acquire knowledge about reality and the nature of things. That's scientism, at least as I'm using the term, and that's what I'm opposed to. And let me give you an example here. The scientific method rests on empiricism, which is basically the idea that empirical evidence is valid. This is obviously a foundational principle of science, that you take empirical evidence to draw conclusions. Without empiricism, there would be no science. So yeah, empiricism, fundamental part of science. Second principle I want to go over: circular logic is not valid. If I say that the sky is blue because the ocean is blue, and then I say the ocean is blue because the sky is blue, I'm making no logical sense. By that same token, empiricism cannot prove itself to be valid. Like the validity of empirical evidence can't rest on empirical evidence, because that would be a circular logic. You'd be assuming that empiricism were already true in trying to prove that empiricism is true. Therefore, if we do accept that empiricism is true, we have to accept that there is some sort of logical backing for empiricism that is not itself grounded in empiricism. What this means, essentially, is that there are areas of knowledge in which logic and reason do apply, but science does not. Science doesn't have a total dominion over all human knowledge. For example, science can't prove itself valid. You would need a logical case for why empiricism makes sense that doesn't rest on science. Like, there's no way for science to address that problem. It's not just like that science can come up with an answer, but I'm saying, that science's answer is wrong. I'm saying there's no way for science to even address that problem. And there's a few different things like this. Just some examples of things that science can't address. I mean, science can be used as a tool in all of these, but none of these can be addressed strictly by science with nothing else. For example, as we mentioned before, science can't justify empiricism. Science can't tell you what ought to be. Now, if you know what is, and you know what ought to be, you can use science to both determine what is and determine the best way to reach what ought to be. But science itself can't tell you how things ought to be. There's no way to apply the scientific method and get an answer to that. Another thing is science can't tell you what good art is. Obviously, you can analyze cultures and what they consider good and bad art and come up with some general ideas of what is usually considered good art, but you can't prove X is good art with science. Another example is metaphysics, like some very fundamental principles of metaphysics, like that things are what they are and stuff like that. There's no way for science to prove those, for the same reason that science can't prove empiricism, because those are fundamental principles that have to be accepted before science even becomes valid. Like, science rests on the idea that we live in a coherent, rational universe in which things are what they are. I mean, there's no way to use science to prove that, because science assumes that. So hopefully after this, my position's a little more clear on what I think scientism is and why I'm opposed to it. By all means, let me know what you think.